Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and I'd like to welcome you to my lecture on Chapter 11 from the Kathy Schwalbe book, Information Technology Management, 8th edition. And Chapter 11 is entitled Project Risk Management. So, we're here to talk about risk. Project risk management is the art and science of identifying, analyzing, and responding to risk throughout the life of a project and in the best interest of meeting project objective. Risk management is often overlooked in projects, but it can help improve project success by helping select good projects, determining project scope, and developing realistic estimates. So, we're worried about risk on our projects. And we think that rather than just worrying about risk on our projects, that perhaps we can do some structured activities to reduce the risk in our project and to manage the risk that remains. Okay, so research by Ibbs and Kwok, two writers in this field, shows that risk has the lowest maturity rating of all the knowledge areas in formal PM. And this is interesting because, of course, risk is such a big deal, right? I mean, when you think about it as a kind of a theme in your project, it's the risk that's going to bite you in the ass, right? So the fact that either when organizations rate themselves or they have others sort of analyze them, the fact that they seem to be doing the least mature job in the risk knowledge area seems a little bit worrisome. So that's not the only research in this area, and the slide talks about two other studies that essentially show that risk management for project is important, and following good software risk management practices pays off. So here is a table from the Ibbs and Kwok study, and we're looking at in the columns we have call them industries, okay? Engineering and construction, telecommunications, information systems, high-tech manufacturing. Down the rows, we have the knowledge areas. And of course, we have risk. In the cells of the table, we have a maturity rating with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. So if we want to talk about information systems, which is the theme of the book, okay, let's just look across the row for information for risk of the of all of the industries. We're the lowest in information systems, and we're only a little bit lower than high-tech manufacturing, but we are in some kind of absolute sense we're the lowest. And then if you look in the information systems column, the maturity rating that we've given ourselves, because that's how we typically do it. We have consultants kind of coach us through a self-evaluation. Is 2.75. That's the lowest of all the ratings in all of the knowledge areas. So when we say it's low, we mean it's low. Um, what are some of the benefits that you can expect from employing uh, project risk management practices? Well, here here's a list of the benefits commonly identified by respondents to a study. So, in order of how often they were identified, the highest was anticipate and avoid problems. Next, prevent surprises. The next, improved ability to negotiate. Next, meet customer commitments. Then reduce schedule slips. Then reduce cost overruns. And then only 6% of the respondents said that they didn't really expect any benefits to come from the use of formal risk management practices on their projects. So that's a pretty small percentage who would say it's not really worth anything at all. Okay? And 80% of people said it's going to help them anticipate and avoid problems. Okay, so let's talk about what risk is. Like the conversation that we had when we were talking about quality, when we're talking about risk in a formal way, sometimes the definition doesn't really match up exactly with our common kind of everyday notion of what we mean by the word. Okay? So, risk in a general sense is variability in outcome. Okay? So it's the probability that the outcome will be different than what we're expecting, and it could be variable on the negative side, which is what people typically think of, or it could be a variable on the positive side. We could have a better outcome than anticipated. So when people talk about risk, they usually are talking about this negative side, and we refer to that in the formal work on risk as negative risk. Okay, so and in fact, the definition that's in the dictionary of the Common English word says the possibility of loss or injury. So the dictionary meaning of risk does have this negative risk connotation. Negative risk involves understanding potential problems that might occur in the project and how they might impede project success. Negative risk management is like a form of insurance. It's an investment. So we have some expectation of the outcome for the project. And we know that there's a probability that it might not turn out that well. So we have some negative risk. We're going to take some actions to make sure that we come in where we expected or better, okay? And that activity that we do, that's going to have some cost to us. And it's kind of like when we go buy insurance. Okay, it's kind of like, let's say we have a car, and we know the expectation that we have is it's not going to get into a collision, but we know there's a risk it will get into a collision, and that's a bad outcome for us. So we buy collision insurance and we have to pay for that. That has some cost, but that's going to make us whole in the case that the negative event should come to pass. So this working to control the risk, our investment in that is like the kind of action we take when we buy insurance. Now, the insight that I like about the formal risk management body of knowledge is that risk can be positive as well. So positive risks are risks that result in good things happening. Sometimes we call these opportunities. So again, we have a basic expectation of what the outcome will be. The outcome could be worse, that's the negative risk, or the outcome could be better, that's the positive risk. So a general definition of project risk is an uncertainty that can have a negative or positive effect on meeting project objectives. So it's variability, it's uncertainty. The goal of project risk management is to minimize the negative risks while maximizing the potential positive risks. And what I really like about this is this makes this kind of practice area twice as big as you would ordinarily think it would be. Okay? You would think that it's all about keeping bad things from happening. And it is about that. But that's only about half of it. The other half of it is about making sure good things or better things do happen. Some organizations don't think about risks in this broad of a way. They only think about the negative risks. So David Hilson, the risk doctor, suggests overcoming the problem by widening the scope of risk management to encompass both strategic risks and upside opportunities, which he refers to as integrated risk management. In a 2014 paper, Hilson described the importance of good working relationships, especially when between the project sponsor and the project manager. And I think this really gets at one of the most important issues in risk management from my point of view, and that's this. If the project sponsor is paying for your project, and if the project sponsor is the person most responsible to the organization for the outcomes in the project, then I think that you as a project manager ought to have a good understanding of how they feel about the risks on the project. You ought to be very close on this, okay? Because what is important is not only the taste that you have for risk, but what's more important is the taste that the project sponsor has, and if different, the taste that the organization as a whole have for risk. So what do we mean? What's this whole the taste you have for risk? Well, theorists in this area talk about there being a risk utility or a risk tolerance. And these are the amount of satisfaction or pleasure received from a potential payoff. Utility rises at a decreasing rate for people who are risk averse. Those who are risk seeking have higher tolerance for risk, and their satisfaction increases when more payoff is at stake. The risk neutral approach achieves a balance between risk and payoff. So what would these look like if they were graphed? Well, they look like these three curves that we see here. So this is called a risk utility preference function. Okay, so this maps the potential payoff against the utility. Okay, so somebody who is risk averse, as we start to risk more, the potential payoff gets higher. They get less and less interested because typically the upside and the downside have some kind of relationship to each other. So the variability is getting greater on both the negative and the positive side. So when we say the potential payoff gets higher, we're just saying that the magnitude of the variability gets higher. So as things get more variable, then they get less and less interested at an increasing rate, or they are interested at a decreasing rate. Risk seekers have the opposite, okay? They're not as interested in activities that don't have a variability. I think they're kind of boring. So as the variability in the activity goes up, they get more and more interested. And what people who behave like this, I think a great example of something like this is people who, for instance, play a game like golf, and they get bored, and so they bet on it. Okay, and so of course, when you're simply playing a round of golf with friends, what's the variability of the outcome? Well, at the end of the day, you could have, a little more pride or a little less pride. But what if you bet $10 on it? Well, you could be $10 richer or poorer. What if you bet $50? What if you bet $100? What if you bet $100,000? Okay, so you see people who are risk seekers will take a relatively non-risky activity like playing golf, and they'll increase the potential payoff by betting on it. And then in between the people who are risk averse and the people who are risk seeking are people who are risk neutral. So as the variability gets greater, their utility gets greater, but only in a proportionate way. So their risk utility preference function is a straight line, like the graph we see in the middle of slide 10. So now we've come to the slide where we identify the processes that are part of the PMI methodology related to project risk management. And they are planning risk management, identifying risks, performing qualitative risk analysis, performing quantitative risk analysis, planning risk responses, and controlling risk. And how do these fall into our project management process groups? Well, in the planning process group, we have most of the processes. Plan risk management, identify risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, plan risk responses. In the monitoring and controlling, we have control risks. So let's talk about planning. So the main output of the process of planning risk management is the risk management plan. Now, I think a really good way to think about your project plan is it's a composite document that has some section, however big or small, that corresponds to each of the knowledge areas. So when we say that there's a risk management plan, we're saying that this is the risk management part of the overall project plan. Okay? The team should review the project documents and understand the organization and the sponsor's approaches to risk. And I can't emphasize this enough. I talked about this a couple of minutes ago. The project manager's approach to risk is interesting, okay? Because that's going to, I think you have to know what your approach to risk is, okay? I think that professionally you owe it to your sponsors to really act on their approach to risk. And if you can't sign up for their approach to risk, then you probably ought to hand it over to a project manager who can. So I don't think you should be pursuing your own taste for risk, your own risk utility preference function, while ignoring that of either the sponsor or, even more importantly, the organization as a whole. Topics addressed in a risk management plan: a methodology, roles and responsibilities, budget and schedule, risk categories, risk probability and impact, revise stakeholders' tolerances for risk, tracking, risk documentation. Okay? So, again, you really have to think about every time we're going to do a project plan that we need to do a project plan that is elaborate enough for the project at hand. We certainly don't want a project plan that is more elaborate than the project itself. Okay? So here's where I remind you in each of the knowledge areas that you don't have to create these things from scratch. Okay? You might have some of these things addressed in documents for your organization that are part of the governance of the organization, in which case you could simply refer out to them. Okay? Things like methodologies or roles and responsibilities, or the way we do tracking, or the way we do documentation, all those kinds of things. You may have a plan from a prior project that you can change and adapt. So we're not to assume that we're to write a treatise from scratch for every project. Now, let's talk about some more terms here. Contingency and fallback plans and contingency reserves. Okay, we've been talking about reserves and contingencies for a couple of chapters now. Okay, you remember that when we were working on time and we're coming up with the schedule, we had this idea that maybe we needed some buffers. Okay, maybe we needed some extra time in the plan to allow for things that were unforeseen. Okay, well, that's how we dealt with it there. Okay, then when we came to costs, we talked about reserving funds in order to deal with unexpected or even expected things that might come up. Okay, partially expected, let's say. And these were contingency reserves. now we have a couple of more terms that fit into this whole how we deal with uncertainty approach. Okay? So we have a new term, contingency plans. These are predefined actions that the project team will take, and if an identified risk event occurs. Then we have fallback plans. These are developed for risks that have a high impact on meeting project objectives and are put into effect if attempts to reduce the risk are not effective. We have contingency reserves or allowances, are provisions held by the project sponsor or organization to reduce the risk of cost or schedule overruns to an acceptable level. And management reserves are funds held for unknown risks that are not part of the cost baseline, but are part of the budget and funding requirements. So management reserves are extra funds that are usually kept within the control of senior management. So senior management is responsible to the financial managers in the organization, to the organization's shareholders or whatever their constituency is. Okay. But and so they may, in order to deal with potential risk, especially on cost, they may reserve some funds that they don't put within the control of the project team. Okay, and that's what we're saying. It's not within the cost baseline, but they are part of the budget and funding. Management reserves. Of course, our text has an IT project focus. Okay, so what are some of the common sources of risk in IT projects? The Standish Group developed an IT success potential scoring sheet based on the potential risks. Other broad categories of risk help identify potential risks. So here's the scoring sheet. Okay, so we're looking at success criterion. So these are things that must go well. Okay, what's the risk? What's the risk that they don't go well? Okay, so the top one, user involvement, then executive management support, clear statement of requirements, proper planning, realistic expectations, etc. Okay, so these are the relative importance, the weight of these, and they weight to 100%. So 20% of the risk, we believe, or nearly 20%, 19, it comes from user involvement. If we get appropriate user involvement, we've got lower risk. If we don't, we've got higher risk. The other thing we can look at, in addition to some kind of more of a checklist like that, are broad categories of risk that we could use in order to kind of brainstorm. Okay, market risk, financial risk, technology risk, people risk, structure and process risk. So do we go through each of these? No, we don't. So I'll talk through each of these on their own. So the market risk is the risk in the economy as a whole. Okay, and this is a risk that I think is fairly well understood mathematically. So, for instance, in the commercial world, where a lot of organizations have public stock, okay, well, their fortunes can be estimated by taking their stock price um, and looking at whether it's going up or down. Okay, and you can take you can take maybe not all the common stocks, but maybe you could take something like the Standard and Poor's 500, the S&P 500. Okay, and you can see how well it's doing. Now, one of the things that they do in stock investments is that they look at the correlation between a particular company or industry and the market as a whole. Because some companies and industries do well when the market as a whole is doing poorly, right? Some do well when the market's doing well. So are they positively correlated with the market as a whole? Are they negatively correlated with the market as a whole? Well, you ought to think about your project, okay? Um, if the economy's doing overall well, is that going to be good for your project or is that going to be bad, right? You can think of the market risk issue as even a level apart from that. And that is, um, what's the risk that there will be a market for the goods or services that will be thrown off by your project? Okay, people typically a project throws off a new or a changed product or service. Um, what's the probability that there really is a market for that service? Is there a market product or service? Is there a market already? Is it growing? Is it shrinking? Um, um, if we get there late, are we going to miss it? If we get there early, are we going to get a bigger market share? So those are the kinds of things you might want to think about related to market. Financial risk has a relationship to market risk because this is the risk that either your project will not perform as expected financially. You'll remember that each of the projects that we have will do some kind of cash flow financial analysis on. So part of the risk is the risk that the costs and the benefits are going to turn out to be what we predict them to be. Okay. The other is has to do with the funding available to our project. Okay. Um, there are times when you have a perfectly good project, but financial times are hard, and they're not going to fund quite so many projects. So your project could get canceled not because it's not going to create value, but because the organization doesn't have the money to invest in it in order to wait for the payback to happen later in the project's financial life cycle. Okay. I guess you could also think of financial risk in the other way, which is you think that the organization can afford to give you, you know, $1 million to do so much of an activity, and times are so good that perhaps they can give you a two, and you can do twice that activity. Well, that's the positive side of financial risk. Technology risk has to do with um, typically, when I think of it, it has to do with how proven is the technology that we might want to use on an IT project. Um, now, we use a lot of technology these days that is pretty mature. So, for instance, for storing our data, we'll use relational database management systems. well, relational database management systems have been commercially viable since about 1980. Well, that's 35 years. That's a long time. So, provided that we're not planning on using a whole new feature that hasn't been delivered yet, if we're planning on using a relational database management system, that's probably not very high technology risk. Programming languages. Perhaps we've decided that we're going to use the Java programming language. Well, the Java programming language has been around since the 90s, and it's 20 some years old, and it's pretty mature. So, provided that we're not using a new feature that's come out in the latest release of Java, and we're risking that there were no potential problems with it. Well, then we probably have pretty low technology risk. So it's just a question of whether the products are actually there or whether we're going to have to wait for them to get there, and the risk can be higher or lower. We've got people risk. Typically, this is the risk of staffing the project. Okay, so that's the risk that we'll be able to find the people. That's the risk that when we find them, we'll be able to hire them. We'll be able to motivate them. They won't turn over, etc. And structure and process risk. As we set up our project, the way we structure the project, the people in it, and the processes in it, and all that kind of stuff, has a risk to it. Okay? If that's all brand new, well, that might be pretty risky. We might not know how it's going to turn out. If the structure and the process that we're using in our project is the same one we've used for a long time, well, we can probably anticipate just exactly what's going to happen. So you can think at these broad categories as ways to help you do risk identification. So risk planning is a big deal for lots of kinds of organizations, even not only in their projects but in their continuing operations. But not everybody pays attention. So in a 2013 survey, risk management was a high priority, but only 66% of the companies said they often build it into their strategy planning decisions. Okay, well, hey, that's not too much higher than half. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And airline incidents cause concerns, especially when lives are lost. In 2015, we had a German wings crash that resulted in 150 deaths, allegedly due to the co-pilot's poor mental state. They responded immediately by implementing a rule that 2 people must be in the cockpit at all times and are considering changes to medical and psychological tests for pilots. I think when you're thinking about risk management, be it for projects or continuing operations, you have to really think a lot about situations that are going to have catastrophic outcomes, especially situations that are going to be sort of irretrievable. Probably the biggest incident, the biggest case of that is one like the airline crash where we have a loss of life. There's no way to get that life back. Okay. Okay, so some tools. Well, you probably won't be surprised that we've taken that breakdown structure concept where we break things down into a taxonomy in order to understand it better, that we want to do that for risk too. So people talk of building a risk breakdown structure, and it's a hierarchy of potential risk categories for a project. So here's one that we put together. It has the IT project. It has general categories: business, technical, organizational, project management, and then within them we break them down further. Now, this is both risk breakdown structure. This could also be, you can always take a hierarchy and turn it into a mind map. And this would be, I think, a great tool for working with a team of people in brainstorming about potential risks, both negative and positive, for your project. So here's a table from the textbook 11-4, in which we go through each of the knowledge areas and come up with a list of potential negative risk conditions associated with each of the knowledge areas. And you can use this kind of a list as kind of a checklist when you're trying to think through your risk plan. Identifying risks. Identifying risks is the process of understanding what potential events might hurt or enhance a particular project. Hurt or enhance, negative or positive. Another consideration is the likelihood of advanced discovery. Risk identification tools and techniques include, these are the ones we're going to talk about: brainstorming, the Delphi technique, interviewing, SWOT analysis. These are all things we've talked about in context of understanding the goals of our project, or picking the right project. Okay, so these are kind of general tools that we can use in several ways. So brainstorming. Brainstorming is a technique by which a group attempts to generate ideas or find a solution for a specific problem by amassing ideas spontaneously and without judgment. Okay, so the idea is you get a group of people. Typically, they come up with the ideas when they're in the room together. They do it spontaneously. We encourage people to participate. We say things like, there's no idea too dumb. We don't allow people to rain on the parade of people who come up with ideas, because we want to generate a lot of ideas, and then typically before we finish the session, we go back and we pick the ones that we like the best. Okay, and the ones that we don't like the best, well, they just kind of die a natural death. An experienced facilitator should run a brainstorming session. I usually like that idea because there are times when, say, the PM, for instance, would like to be a participant without the responsibility of being kind of a neutral facilitator. Be careful not to overuse or misuse it. It's interesting. The psychological literature shows that individuals produce a greater number of ideas working alone than they do through brainstorming in small face-to-face groups. The group effects often inhibit idea generation. So I think there are two problems with brainstorming in its classic form. One is that people try to come up with their ideas on the spot, okay? And that's not how a lot of ideas happen. Sometimes ideas happen through people thinking about ideas for several days or several weeks at a time. Two, the group dynamics tend to inhibit or they have a chilling effect on some of the participants. So A couple of things that you could do to offset that is, one, you could give people homework ahead of time and ask them to come with a list, okay? And the other thing is you could be hyper vigilant about not having group dynamics that have a chilling effect on uh, uh, your participants. Another technique that is kind of a competitor to brainstorming is this Delphi technique. So the Delphi technique is used to derive a consensus among a panel of experts who make predictions about future developments. It provides independent and anonymous input regarding future events. Okay, so independent. Okay, so the contributors don't work in the same room. Sometimes they work through some kind of a facilitated thing using online tools or the mail, such that they're working asynchronously. So they can't see each other, and they also don't know who came up with which idea. So that then they use repeated rounds of questioning and written responses to avoid the biasing effects possible in oral methods such as brainstorming. Okay? Now, I've not worked directly with the Delphi technique. I typically ask my students, have they ever been in a situation where they use the Delphi technique? And I get a couple, and they usually have good things to report, right? So to the extent that I've got people who have got something to report about real experiences with the technique, the few who have used it generally have good things to say about it. Interviewing. Interviewing is a fact-finding technique for collecting information in face-to-face, phone, email, or instant messaging discussions. Interviewing people with similar project experience is an important tool for identifying potential risks. Okay, so whether you do this formally or informally, I think that you are you're only being responsible if you go out and find people who have had prior experience in projects, and you go out and say, okay, we're doing this project and we're thinking about the risks, and what do you think? Or, here's what we have so far, or here are the big ones that we're thinking about. Where from your experience, what kind of things should we be thinking about that don't seem to be on our radar? You'd be surprised how people with real experience can say, look at such and such. You wouldn't think it would be a big problem, but it typically is. That's where you can gain a lot of value. SWOT analysis we talked about way back when we were talking about project selection. SWOT analysis is the standard management consulting approach to strategic planning. Okay? And SWOT, if you recall, stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Okay? It helps to identify the broad negative and positive risks that apply to the project. Okay, so generally speaking, the part of SWOT that is most closely related to risk analysis is opportunities and threats. But of course, opportunities and threats are only significant in light of your strengths and your weaknesses. So a full SWOT analysis could be a good use of your time. Now we're going to talk about some of the artifacts, some of the documents that you could produce while you're doing your risk planning. And the primary one is this thing that people use, and it's used pretty broadly. It's called a risk register. The main output of a risk identification process is a list of identified risks and other information needed to begin creating a risk register. So a risk register is a document that contains the results of various risk management processes, and this is often displayed in a table or spreadsheet format. It's a tool for documenting potential risk events and related information. And what do we mean by risk event? These are uncertain events that may occur to the detriment or the enhancement of the project. An earthquake. We win the lottery. Okay? We win a giant contract. Our library is destroyed by fire. Okay? Risk events. Okay, risk register contents. Let's just look at one here, okay? Here's one. So each risk has a number. We can rank them. We have a risk. That's the risk name. Then we have the description. It sometimes helps to categorize them to make sure that we've got good coverage. Root cause. So what could really cause this risk to, what really drives this? Triggers. These are risk events. How could we know that this risk is about to come down upon us because some kind of a trigger event has happened? Potential responses. We haven't talked about risk response planning, but we will in a minute. Risk owner. Typically what we do is we have a person that's part of our project, a part of the stakeholder group and team who's responsible for keeping their eye on the risk. What's the probability that it's going to happen? What's the impact? And what's the current status? Okay? Now, people use these and they review them. They create one of these at the beginning of the project and they review them from time to time. And this turns out to lead to a pretty good conversation over the life of the project about risk. Okay, so when we've identified the risk, how do we analyze these things? Well, we've got two sets of tools: qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis. And I've got to tell you that when I was studying for the PMP exam, I had a hard time getting straight which was which, because qualitative risk analysis is kind of subjective and quantitative is more numerical. But when you look at the qualitative risk analysis in a subjective way, we put things into charts and graphs. So it's easy to say, well, isn't that quantitative? So you can easily get a little confused about which of these things that we talk about is included in the qualitative list and which is included in the quantitative list. So, in fact, the person who wrote this slide forgot that I think what we're saying is risk qualification tools include probability impact matrices, that's qualitative, top 10 risk item tracking, that's qualitative again, expert judgment, that's qualitative. So the person who authored the slide here got suckered into putting the word quantification where they really wanted to say qualification. Um, so, what's a probability impact matrix? Well, it's a matrix or chart that lists the relative probability of a risk occurring on one side of the matrix and the relative impact of the risk having occurred on the other. Um, we list the risks and then we label each one as high, medium, or low in terms of the probability of occurrence and its impact if it did occur. You can also calculate risk factors. These are numbers that represent the overall risk of specific events based on their probability of occurring and the consequences of the project if they do occur. So here is the classic probability impact matrix, right? So I bet, so on the y-axis, probability, how likely is it to occur? On the x-axis, impact, what's the magnitude of the damage that it's going to do? It's not surprising that when we rate these things as high, like in this particular one, risk 1 and risk 4, that they're going to get a lot of our attention. They're highly probable and highly now, again, it's not only damaging, it's not only the negative, but they have a high variability, okay? Positive or negative. Low, things that are low sometimes don't even get on our radar. They don't have a big impact, they have a low risk of occurring. Why waste airtime on them? So it's not too surprising that we don't have anything there because we just don't even want to talk about those. And then we fill out the rest of this matrix as appropriate. Another way that you could do this is you could take the probability of failure as a percent, and 1.0 being 100% probable, 0 being 0% probable. And then we could have the consequence of failure, 1.0 being catastrophic consequences, and 0 being no consequences at all. And that we could plot a point for each risk, and then we could categorize them into bands. So the outer band is the high risk, the middle band is the medium risk, the lower band is the low risk. Okay, so these are two types of matrices or charts. Top 10 risk item tracking is a qualitative risk analysis tool that helps to identify risks and maintain awareness of risk throughout the life of a project. So you establish a periodic review of the top 10 project risk items. You list the current ranking, previous ranking, number of times the risk appears on the list over a period of time, and a summary of progress made in resolving the risk item. So let's look at this. So here's a top 10 risk item tracking report. Now, so again, we have the risk event. We've got the risk rank this month, the rank last month, number of months in the top 10, risk progress resolution. I think it's a nice idea to do this because what happens is that sometimes we think about risks and then they fade into the background. So we ought to do this often enough that it sort of refreshes our dedication to managing them. because the likelihood that certain things will happen will go up or down throughout the life of a project. And so the things that are the biggest opportunities for us in the beginning of the problem may fade, and we may be less with another group. Okay. A watch list is a list of risks that are low priority but are still identified as potential risks. These are things that are not on the top 10, but we don't want to lose track of them entirely. Qualitative analysis can also identify risks that should be evaluated on a quantitative basis. Okay. So I just want to point out the stuff we've talked about so far is all qualitative, even though there are numbers and graphs involved. Okay. And my explanation for why they're considered qualitative is that they're subjective. Okay. So, this is what you have to get your head around when you're trying to figure what is officially a qualitative risk as compared to what's a quantitative risk. Here's a media snapshot story. The story of the Titanic is known throughout the world. It happened over 100 years ago now that the Titanic sank. A recent article on PMI's virtual library explains how to avoid the Titanic factor in your projects by analyzing the interdependence of risks. For example, the probability of one risk event occurring might change if another one materializes, and responses to one risk event might affect another. So it's commonly thought that in the design of the Titanic, which was called unsinkable when they designed it, they did a pretty good job of planning for individual risks happening individually, but they did a very bad job of anticipating a number of negative risks coming to pass at exactly the same time. And so having torn open the side of the vessel and having put and having let water into too many compartments at the same time, they found themselves in bad trouble. So this kind of thing could happen to a project, right? So thinking about how your project, how your risks might be interrelated and not independent, is, I think, good advice. Performing quantitative risk analysis. Often, after qualitative risk analysis, we'll move on and do a more quantitative risk analysis. We can do them at the same time, side by side. Large complex projects involving leading edge technologies often require extensive quantitative risk analysis. The main techniques include decision tree analysis, simulation, and sensitivity analysis. And these are all good things that you should have a good feel for. Some are more commonly known than others. Okay, so why don't we begin with decision trees and expected monetary value. Now, before I learned about this, I learned about expected monetary value when I went to business school back in the late 1970s. And in the business where I was working, we had a number of decisions that came up that we didn't know how to analyze them. We just didn't know how to quantify the risks involved. And it turned out that expected monetary value, this decision tree approach, was very promising for us. And so we went from a world where we were saying, well, gee whiz, I wonder how risky this is, and I wonder what kind of decision we should make to go ahead and bid on this project or not. Um, we went from just kind of thinking about it and gee whizzing it to actually having some calculations to do that I found reassuring. Okay? Um, so the expected monetary value, or EMV, is the product of a risk event probability between 0 and 1. Okay? So it's a percentage. And the risk event's monetary value. So you can draw a decision tree to help you find the expected monetary value in a particular scenario. So here we've got two projects that we can decide upon. Okay, and let's say we're either going to do project one or project two, but not both. Okay, and in project one, um, there is a 20% probability that we'll have a $300,000 favorable outcome. So we'll have a $300,000 profit. There's an 80% probability that we'll have a $40,000 loss. On project two, we see it as three kind of probability groupings. A 20% probability that we'll lose $50,000. A 10% probability that we'll lose $20,000. And a 70% probability that we will gain $60,000. Now, how do you weight these against each other? And expected monetary value theory says, well, you take the probabilities and you multiply them times the expected outcome, and you get the expected monetary value. So you have on project one, you've got 20% of $300,000 or $60,000. You've got 80% of a $40,000 loss, so negative $32,000. So the project expected monetary value is the sum of those two, or $28,000. Okay? Whereas project two, when you do the math, we get $30,000. Now, I find these things to be helpful because you can just get kind of broad comparisons. Now, as I've said in a couple of the comparisons we've seen within this book, in my mind, $28,000 and $30,000 are the same thing. Okay? What's the probability that we're wrong in our estimates that it's going to have a $2,000 impact on the bottom line? Well, probably pretty high. This is within the variability of the method that we're using. So I see these two projects as pretty much equal. Okay? On the other hand, I kind of like the fact that project two has a 70% chance of a big outcome. So I guess what I would say is if I had these two, okay, I would favor project two. Okay? That may be because I'm risk averse. I don't think I would roll the dice and try at a 20% chance at $300,000. That's starting to sound like buying a lottery ticket to me. Okay? Because when we look at the expected monetary value, they're pretty much the same. If one was substantially higher than the other, if project one had expected monetary value of $35,000 and project two had $30,000, well, okay. You know, it's different by a sixth. All right, maybe that's really significant. But this can be very helpful in these uncertain situations. What can you expect? Okay, you have to make assumptions, but given you make the assumptions, it gives you a fairly deterministic answer, which I like. Or if things are more complex than this, okay, if you can't break your probabilities up into a few groups that can be used in a decision tree, you can do a you can create a mathematical model with a simulation tool using Monte Carlo analysis. Um, so Monte Carlo analysis simulates a model's outcome many times to provide a statistical distribution of the calculated results. To use the Monte Carlo simulation, you must have three estimates, most likely, pessimistic, and optimistic, remember per, plus an estimate of the likelihood of the estimate being between the most likely and the optimistic values. So, what are the steps of doing a Monte Carlo analysis? You assess the range for the variables being considered. You determine a probability distribution for each of the variables. For each variable, you select a random value based on the probability distribution. You run a deterministic analysis or one pass through the model. You repeat steps 3 and 4 many times through a chain to obtain a probability distribution of the model's results. Okay? And so then you get a probability distribution like we have here. Okay? So Monte Carlo simulation is cool stuff. I haven't used it in planning a project myself. I'm a man who's been in search of the right project to use Monte Carlo simulation on for 35 years. I still haven't found one that's the right one for me. I have had some people in my classes who said that they have been part of projects where they did Monte Carlo simulation on some aspect of the risks in their project, and they found it satisfying. So a few reports, and those reports were all good. Uh, what went right? Excel's a common tool for performing quantitative risk analysis. GM using simulation for forecasting its net income, predicted structural costs and purchasing costs of vehicles, and determining the company's susceptibility to different kinds of risk. P&G uh, uses this kind of approach to model foreign exchange risk. Simulation can also be used on agile projects. Now, the analysis that we typically associate with sensitivity analysis, with spreadsheet tools, it's sensitivity analysis. Now, I remember when I went to business school, sensitivity analysis was a big deal. Okay, and because when I went to business school, we didn't have electronic spreadsheets yet. So we had paper spreadsheets and business calculators. But now we're all used to using Excel or whatever the equivalent tool is. And sensitivity analysis almost, it seems like a non-technique because it's just the way we use spreadsheets. So sensitivity analysis is a technique used to show the effects of changing one or more variables on an outcome. For example, many people use it to determine what the monthly payments for a loan will be given different interest rates or periods of the loan, or for determining break-even points based on different assumptions. Spreadsheet software such as Excel is a common tool for performing sensitivity analysis. Okay, so here's a sensitivity analysis that's using Excel, I believe. And this one is pretty sophisticated because what we're doing is so we have units sold. So we have a series of assumptions about units sold. Then we see what the revenue will be. Then we see what the expense will be. And how do we figure this out? Well, we have a variable, the sales price per unit. We have the manufacturing cost per unit. We have the fixed monthly expenses. And then we're able to calculate the break-even point units sold and the revenue at the break-even point. Okay? So the nice thing about this is that you look at this and you go, that would be pretty good. Okay, so if we're able to get $12 a unit for this, and we're able to sell if we're able to get $12 a unit and the manufacturing cost is $8 and the fixed monthly expense is $25,000, we only have to sell $62.50 to break even. Well, I'm sure we're going to sell $62.50. Okay, good. What if we only get $9 per unit? So you just go in, you change it to 9, and you look how things change. Well, what if we get $15 per unit? So what you do is you kind of look at this. You kind of say, what if? So sensitivity analysis is what if analysis. How sensitive are the bottom line answers to changes in the assumptions? Now, this, 35 years ago, this was a very highfalutin technique that they were teaching in the top business schools. I'm sure they still teach it there, but the fact is that almost anybody who knows how to use a spreadsheet does this intuitively now. Okay, so this is real good stuff. It's just as useful as it always was, and it's pretty much within our current everyday analytical thought pattern. Planning risk responses. So after identifying and quantifying risks, you must decide how to respond to them. We can have 4 main response strategies for negative risks: risk avoidance, risk acceptance, risk transference, and risk mitigation. Okay, so we don't have a slide for each one. So risk avoidance. Well, we're just not going to do that. So you go to your doctor and you say, doctor, when I stand on one leg and I hop up and down, it really hurts. And the doctor says, well, don't go like that. Okay, risk avoidance. Risk acceptance. Okay, this is when you look at a risk and you just say, okay, we'll take that risk the way it is. The probability that it's going to happen and its expected impact are tolerable. Risk transference. Okay. The typical example of risk transference is when you buy insurance. Okay, with a negative risk. Another example would be if it's kind of like insurance, you create some kind of contract where some other organization is assuming that risk. Okay, it's not insurance per se, but it acts like insurance. And risk mitigation has to do with trying to lower the impact of the risk should it occur. So we realize it could occur, It could have $100,000 impact. It could have $1 million impact. We want to make sure that it comes in more on the $100,000 side than on the $1 million side. So here are general risk mitigation strategies for technical cost and schedule risks. Okay, so I'm going to leave those for you to read on your own. That's from the book, Table 11.7. Now, the response strategy categories for positive risks are just a little different because it's kind of the other side of the same coin. Okay, so our talk about it and our thinking about it, it's just kind of, you might say it's reversed or reflected. I don't know what you want to say. So we have risk exploitation, risk sharing, risk enhancement, risk acceptance. So risk exploitation. This is where we have a risk. It has a positive outcome, and we're going to do everything that we can to exploit that risk and make sure that happens. Okay? Risk sharing is kind of like insurance, okay? Except what we do is we share some of the upside to make sure that it happens. The classic example of this was in Minneapolis when they had a collapse of their bridge. I think it was on I-35. The whole economy was impacted because people had to really take a big detour. So when they let the contract for replacing the bridge, they gave the contractor a pretty big incentive for bringing the project in early because it represented a savings to the stakeholders. They just were burning up a lot of gasoline for nothing, so long as they had to take the detour. And not surprisingly, the contractor was able to bring the project in several months early. It was a win-win. So by sharing the upside with partners, you can make the positive more likely to occur. Okay? It's sort of like the corollary to insurance. Risk enhancement is sort of like exploitation, but it's really all in. It's kind of like a doubling down. It's kind of like, well, let's find a way to get more exposure to this so we have an even bigger upside. And risk acceptance is kind of the same deal. We're prepared to accept the risk, the probability it's going to happen, and the size of the expected outcome. Those are just fine for us. We're just going to keep our eye on this. Here's a really interesting concept: residual risks and secondary risks. So it's always important to identify them both. Residual risks are risks that remain after all of the response strategies have been implemented. Okay, so you're not going to get all the risk out of a project. Okay, but you can influence it. Okay, so you shouldn't have the expectation that you're going to take all the risk out of a project. Secondary risks are really important things to do. It's important to understand their nature. That's what I'm saying. They're a direct result of implementing a risk response. Okay, so in the medical field, they have a mandate: first, do no harm. So they want to make sure that some kind of intervention that they take is not going to be worse than the original problem. Okay, And you'll hear of situations. I'm trying to think. There's a Korean ferry that sunk with a pretty large loss of life um, within the last couple of years, and I'm trying to remember what the captain did, but the captain did something in response to the initial problem um, that compounded it. I think what he did is he told all the passengers to stay in place because he was afraid that he was going to capsize. Um, and so, by having the passengers stay in place, a high proportion of them drown. So, um, so in his risk response, when the original event happened, he actually got a worse outcome, I believe, than he would have gotten had he not told the passengers one thing or the other and just allowed some of them to try to evacuate and others to not. So you really have to remember that uh, the medical maximum first, do no harm. Controlling risks. So controlling risks involves executing the risk management process to respond to risk events and ensure that risk awareness is ongoing and performed by the entire project team throughout the entire project. We also have these things called workarounds. Now, they're responses to risk, but they're not planned. So, workarounds are unplanned responses to risk events that must be done where there are no contingency plans. Okay? So, just because we have some kind of event occur and we don't have a plan for it, that doesn't mean that we sit there and take it in the teeth. Well, then we try to find some kind of a workaround for it. The main outputs of risk control are work performance information, change requests, updates to the project management plan, other project documents, and organizational process assets. How could we use software to do this? We know we're at the bitter end when we come to that. Risk registers can be created with word processing tools or spreadsheet tools or databases. More sophisticated risk management software such as Monte Carlo simulation tools can help in analyzing project risks. And you can purchase add-ons for Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Project to add more simulation capabilities. So what are the results of good project risk management? Well, unlike crisis management, good project risk management often goes unnoticed. Well-run projects appear almost effortless, but a lot of work goes into running a project well. Project managers should strive to make their jobs look easy to reflect the results of well-run projects. But I think it's really important to remind the stakeholders that the reason that we have the good experience that we do is that we take all the precautions and we make all the efforts that we do. Sometimes you'll get exactly the opposite conclusion taken from these things. Somebody will say, well, I don't know why we worry about this stuff because, nothing ever goes wrong on this project. And there's a part of me that says that you need a project every once in a while that goes completely sideways. So you have a project to point to and say, well, that wasn't true with the XYZ project. Remember that disaster? And they all go, oh, yeah. Okay, so um, yeah, we want it to look effortless, but at the same time, we don't want the stakeholders to lose their appreciation for this activity because it's very important. Having said that, I'm going to say bye until next time. Bye bye.